Jr., who was John Hare Powell's oldest son, who was born in 1818. And in the surviving letters of the Powells, there's several notes like this, where Samuel Powell must have gone through them in June of 1876. They're all from around that time, and made little comments. So this one is really fun because this is a letter from, the letter that he's writing on is a letter from Elizabeth Powell to Bushrod Washington's mother. But it actually talks about this Joseph Wright portrait, that at some point the Powells acquired this portrait, but it's not quite known how. But what's really neat about this is that this is the only primary source evidence of the Powells, or at least Elizabeth Powell, owning the portrait from that time. So no matter what, by 1818, when Samuel Powell Jr. was born, she had the portrait. So to honor her friend, she had it in a very public place. She likely had it in a dining room or a parlor, and she very much was, proud of her friend, and probably very proud of this portrait, because at this point Washington had been dead for quite a while and the revolutionary generation was, passing away. But this little note talks about how Bushrod Washington, who is Washington's nephew, was very close with Elizabeth. So he would dine every Sunday with her when he was holding court in Philadelphia, when he was a Supreme Court justice. And so Samuel Powell talks about remembering this. However, the best part is he says that, "Thus I remember my father, John Hare Powell, delighted to tease my aunt by saying Wright's picture of General Washington was badly painted, when she invariably appealed to Judge Washington, who always sustained her in asserting it was an admirable likeness." So it's kind of fun because it really ties together her whole sort of, Washington always had a place in her heart, even long after he had passed away. So they just had a very neat friendship. And it's cool because now we have a portrait of Elizabeth here at Mount Vernon, and she had her portrait of George Washington. So it's like they're connected throughout time. But I also love, just because her and John Hare Powell had a very fun relationship. So I'd love to talk about that in a whole other talk. So that's really all I have. I know it's always hard to talk at people, so I'm excited for questions. So yeah.
Thank you, Samantha.
Yeah.
Tremendous presentation, the breadth, and even, the breadth, but also the details. It was just excellent. Just thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And like I said, we do, and you said as well, there is an intimate audience tonight. So you need to send your questions to the chat. Feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like, and pose your questions. There's quite a lot to discuss.
Yeah.
I have one. Sam, can you talk about, so when Washington dies, what is Elizabeth's response to that?
Sure. Yeah. So when Washington dies, Martha is of course at Mount Vernon, and Elizabeth saw Washington one more time in the end of 1798, in December of 1798, but then unfortunately never made it back to Mount Vernon after that 1787 trip that she took with Samuel. So she didn't see George or Martha again, but she actually is the first non-family member to write a condolence letter. She sends it Christmas Eve. So she writes a very touching, not super long, but very touching letter to Martha about kind of making sure Martha is okay. But really all she says about him is that, about herself and him, is that she's lost a much valued friend. So very, yeah.
What kind of relationship did she have with Anne Willings Bingham?
So Anne Willing Bingham was actually her niece. So Anne Willing Bingham was her niece, and her very first niece to be born. And Elizabeth actually lived with Thomas Willing, her father, Anne Willing Bingham's father, until she got married to Samuel. So Anne Bingham grew up alongside Elizabeth and would have been, kind of her little pet, I'm sure. And I think Elizabeth was very close with Anne throughout her whole life. So I think Anne kind of learned from Elizabeth how to be a good hostess and salonier. So yes, they were close and lived right down the street from each other.
Did they entertain? Is there any, how do I say, record of visiting each other, since Anne was this hostess with the mostest?
There's not actually, now that you say that, there's not actually any records of them entertaining together or records of them being at each other's houses, but I'm sure they were. And they did go, there is a note about going in a carriage together somewhere. So I think because it's hard because there's not a ton of documentary evidence from the 1780s and 90s. So much of it survives because of the George Washington connection. But I'm able to tease out other things from that. So
thank you.
Yeah.
And Sam, you just kind of touched upon it. You said that a lot of these anecdotes and everything are being teased out of the information that you received because of the Washingtons. How did Mount Vernon come to have all of the Powell letters?
Yeah, so Mount Vernon actually has a very long Powell connection. Not only were George and Martha, of course, good friends with the Powells, but we were very lucky enough to have 2 Powell descendants on our board. So in the 1950s, we had Hope Powell Harkness was our regent for Rhode Island. And it was around that time that some of the family papers and objects and things were being given to museums and things. So we were very lucky enough through her and through another descendant of that same generation to end up with these manuscripts purchased. We did purchase them, but that's how we ended up with them. So we've had them since the 1940s, I believe. So quite a long time. Yeah.
Do you still get things?
We still get manuscripts. We haven't gotten any Powell things, much to I would love if some more Washington Powell letters came out of the woodwork. Because there are some missing. In some letters, they say, oh, I got your letter of the 7th, and there is no letter from the 7th that survives. So I do find it interesting what is kept and what isn't kept. So.
Along that note, we have another question in the chat. Speaking generally, do receipts or other financial records that show the cost of parties in this period still survive? Perhaps they're in the George Washington papers or in the Library of Congress or elsewhere?
Yes. Normally it wasn't just like itemized receipts in that sense. It depends, I guess. Like you would have to pinpoint the date of the party and then every receipt that surrounds that. And every loose receipt doesn't survive. However, like Washington would make different staples lists, or he would list out every single expense for like Valley Forge or things like that. So it would be like provisions for the troops and stuff like that. But unfortunately, there's really not, there's not necessarily a way to pinpoint exactly what cost a party would be, but I'm sure by piecing it together there could be a way to do it, but it all depends on what survives. And I will say for the Powells, Samuel Powell's financial records survive from that period, but they're very, very vague. They're very thorough but very vague. It's a lot of just on your account with no description of what it actually is that he's paying for. So
one could surmise that her 50th birthday in 1793, that party was a big bash. I think, it was well known throughout the society. A lot of people attended and used it as a time, like they used it as like a time or a milestone, right? Didn't you say?
Yeah, like a big milestone. I should have said in the talk, I didn't think about this, but it wasn't that common to have a birthday party, I don't think. So I think that at that period, so I think it shows her high standing and her high esteem that there would be a birthday party thrown by her and Samuel. Like it's not that it was thrown at Ricketts Amphitheater or something, but the fact that so many people attended is really cool. And there is a diary entry, which I had thought about mentioning, but this after Elizabeth dies, the this man who had been a young man at the time that her party happened writes that she's passed away. And what he brings up, of all things, he says, I was one of the many members of the well-attended party that was thrown for Elizabeth's 50th birthday in 1793. And that summer she lost her husband, and she's been a benevolent widow ever since. And that's all he says. So 37 years later, that's what he remembers. So this was a bash. This was quite memorable.
Probably her garment trimmed in squirrel.
In her squirrel, yeah, her
It really made an impression.
Yeah, quite, and dancing with the French minister. That comes from a memoir, a later memoir. So I take this family member's memoir with some like veil of if it's true or not. But for the most part, when he gets things right, he gets them mostly right. So it could have been mink fur instead of squirrel.
A lot of squirrels in Society Hill.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong though, but like on the note that like this is what the person remembered, like really Elizabeth became quite a fixture in Philadelphia by this point and onward. And I think that, and you can always quote these things so much better than I can, but even when Adams writes about like he would see her before he would see
anybody else. Yep. Rather churches and all this stuff. Yeah. But oh yeah, everybody talks about her all throughout her later years of her life. She really is a fixture, and people seek her out. She very much kind of develops this little network of the younger generation who are, it's a lot of her family members, but then a lot of children of close family friends, which is kind of fun to see those letters because she will occasionally reflect back on their parents or something like that, but very, very sparingly. But it's neat to see kind of how she mothers these younger people. So, but yes, John Adams, he knew she didn't like him very well, but he liked her. She loved Abigail. And so I think to John, who is actually, his bust is right to the side of me. I think to John, maybe he just never felt, quite as, he was probably sad that Elizabeth didn't like him as much as Abigail.
I know we much quote his sinful feast entry in the letter that he sent to Abigail.
Yes. And she, a couple of times, she wasn't in Philadelphia a lot, sadly. Abigail wasn't. So John will write back occasionally saying that he's seen Mrs. Powell. And one letter he says, like, she's so sad you're not here, and she thinks you're so great, and you're the compliment to your sex. And then he puts like several little things, and then he puts etc., etc., etc. So I think she probably just went on and on, and he decided three affirmations was enough. So that to me is also a testament of how she was as a conversationalist too, which people talk about that she was a big talker. So
yeah, don't her family members sort of criticize it in a way?
Yeah, people kind of tease her for it, and most people are really kind of enamored with it, but yeah, her family members tease her, and then it definitely is kind of the main thing people either really like about her or really don't like about her. So it definitely depends on the person, but yeah, her family members tease her about it. And then I like to imagine, I know I brought up John here, Powell, really briefly. He and her were very, very similar. So I have to imagine he might have been kind of a talker too, and they probably had great conversations, dramatic conversations.
Certainly long ones.
Certainly long ones, and certainly long.
Well, that's great. Is there any other questions? Feel free to type them in the chat or unmute yourselves. We'd love to hear anything you have to ask.
Yeah, and I know there's a couple of docents too. That's really exciting. I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad everybody's here. It's really neat. So
it's a great bunch, to be sure.
Yeah.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, I want to thank everyone for attending our inaugural virtual event. We are so pleased to have you, Samantha. This was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Everyone have a great evening.
Bye.
Thanks.